Hello. I am going to talk today about, sorry, I'm trying to get the Zoom table off. But today we are going to talk about writing a technically appropriate paper. And so our next big question is like, how do we do that? How do we write a paper as we're pulling together our first research paper for assignment 2, where we are summarizing and synthesizing other sources? How do we do so that follows these conventions of typical writing? And in this case, we're talking about typical research writing with APA format. So we're going to start this PowerPoint through video that you're going to watch for your pre-class work, and then we'll continue it on in class. So we'll do the second half of this PowerPoint in class and then do a follow-up activity. Today, by the end of this lecture and class, you are going to be able to identify key APA writing style rules, be able to appropriately cite sources within your paper. So for assignment 2, but then again, assignment 3 and other graduate papers you're going to write here at Springfield College or elsewhere. And edit your 4 to 6 page paper, synthesis paper that you're doing for assignment 2 so that's ready to go. The outcome that this is associated with is student outcome number 8, where you're working on writing a research sample. So in assignment 2, you're about to submit a writing synthesis of other research articles. So you are pulling together all these papers as a research paper, but you are synthesizing other research papers. As we talked about last lecture, that takes a lot of forethought. You really have to pull those different ideas together. How do the papers similar? How are they different? And synthesize and summarize them in a way that a reader can follow. A little bit of what we're going to talk today is going to dovetail with what we talked about last lecture, where you organize it, and then how do you maintain that organization in a way that helps the right reader. We're also going to focus on other specific technical writing conventions in terms of how you do citations really carefully. What specific punctuation do we use if we're using APA? Think about why this is important. Some of it is that we just need to be able to all be on the same page and follow the same rules. We need to know that when we write something a certain way, we know what information that's presenting. We want it to be in a concise way. We want it to be clear. And we really want to be able to follow our sources and know who is the support that are going with, or what support is going with the different ideas that are being presented in that paper. So if you look at your assignment 2, the rubric is generally broken down into these 4 areas. The first is content and organization. The second is writing style. The third is citing sources and text, and the fourth is bibliography. We really focused on the bibliography as a part of assignment 1, although you are expected to revise and update your bibliography for assignment 2 based on the feedback you received. And we talked a lot about content organization last class. So a lot of this lecture is going to focus in on writing style and citing sources and text, and that's what we'll talk about when we're in person. So last class, our writing style or our organization content flow was really set it up so that our section that we're writing, this 4 to 6 page section that we're going to write, begins with an introductory paragraph where you introduce the major problem that you're addressing and the purpose of that section. So what kind of information you're going to get across. Then you spend the middle paragraphs summarizing and synthesizing your research. And so that's going to be describing studies and talking about how they are similar and different, or maybe pulling a couple of studies together and talking about how they all work together to make a certain argument. At the end, we talked about how you're going to finish with a summary. So you are going to finish with some sort of overall concluding paragraph. That's a lot of last class, but the other things that we can really build on is we need to make sure that that organization and flow is set up for your readers to be able to follow along with what you're trying to say. Really work on your continuity. So start off with like being very clear in what studies you are ordering and in what section. You want to make sure that a very logical way of describing them, introduce, discuss, conclude. This really helps the reader follow your thoughts and your ideas. Use transitions between paragraphs, Help us know how you went from A to B to C to D, because that should be a very logical thing that we should be able to follow. Then, once we move away from sort of the broader concept of organization, most of this technical elements that we're going to discuss today are more about thinking about what are the specific like phrasings, wording, punctuation. It's going to be really picky because APA is kind of really picky, but it's meant to help readers be able to follow along. It's meant to improve clarity. It's meant to improve flow. So hear me out, try it out in your own writing style, and start to look at the papers that you're reading for your assignment two and start to see where they're doing similar things. So generally in APA style or in scientific writing in general, we try to minimize fancy words, jargon, or lengthy prose. And when I say jargon, what I'm talking about is technical terms that are really only used in the context of a certain thing. You really want to focus on clearly saying what's being said and move on. So you really just want to get the point across. You don't need to spend a whole lot of time drilling down on a point. You also, when possible, try to shorten your phrases. So here, one option would be to write a total of 68 participants. But I could change this. I could remove the a total of and just start 68 participants, but we don't really like to start sentences with numbers. So the best way to write this in the most concise format is to write participants in parentheses, big N, remember we talked about that in sampling, equals 68. And then I could say participants completed a certain set of questionnaires or complete participants engaged in an intervention, whatever the rest of that sentence is. But at that point, that is the shortest, most direct way to get across the point. I can also want to use shorter words, short sentences, and short paragraphs, generally speaking. So try to avoid paragraphs that are longer a page, but you want to make sure they're not so short that they're less than 3 sentences as a general rule of thumb. Really avoid run-on sentences or sentences with overly complex structures. Those can be hard to follow as a reader. So you want to keep your sentences clear, kind of short and to the point, and really avoid redundancy in thoughts or words or thoughts as you're going across. You don't want to use the same word like they reported this, they reported this, they reported this. You want to change up your words, but then you also want to make sure your concepts that you're describing, you're not saying the same thing over and over again. A couple of things, and to sort of stick you on this and saying what you mean, try to avoid colloquialisms or phrases that are not necessarily going to mean the same thing to everybody. So if you say a large part, very few, a lot, those are phrases that I don't necessarily know if my a lot or your a lot means the same thing. So you want to be more specific and give me the exact numbers when possible, give specific data. Avoid colloquial phrasings that aren't necessarily going to be understood by everybody, or are a little bit less scientific in voice. You really want to focus on using that scientific voice where you might be saying so-and-so examined as opposed to they looked at. They reported versus they've shown. They argued as opposed to they think or they believed. And so really focus in on that's just writing style stuff, but it does amp up the level of your paper. Couple of other things to think about. You really want to work on an active voice. So instead of saying research was designed by, you could say Matthews et al. 2021 designed. So the way I would actually read that aloud, because I'm not going to read the parentheses aloud, what I would say is Matthews et al. Designed the research too. And so it's a really direct sentence. Instead of saying it was done by somebody, you want to say, here's what they did. Coughlin investigated. And so that's a way that you can get across a point with fewer words, and it can be, sometimes you can get tripped up by writing more complex phrases when you say designed by, and sometimes what you're writing isn't actually what you mean. Another thing, most research writing is done in the past tense. Generally, you are describing or presenting somebody else's work that's already been done. So instead of saying Matthews indicates, you say Matthews et al. Indicated. Instead of saying Coughlin reports, you say Coughlin reported. There are a handful of exceptions to this. This is when you're talking about theory or something that is ongoing. You can use present tense, or you might be making recommendations for future research. That's going to be future research. Or you're going to say you're going to propose doing a study in the future, also going to be future tense. But most of the time in this paper for assignment 2 and assignment 3, you're going to be synthesizing previous research. You're going to be using past tense for me. This is a bit of a picky thing, but it is in the APA manual. You want to avoid anthropomorphism. Sometimes this is also called personification or giving human properties to objects. For instance, results sections or research or studies are all things. They didn't do the work, they didn't collect the data, they didn't write the paper. And so instead, we want to give credit where credit is due. The researchers revealed that high jumpers performed. The study, or instead of saying the study described, you could say Matthews et al. Described higher functioning or occurred. Sometimes you can even actually shorten the sentence altogether and write a better sentence by cutting out the citation at all, maybe putting the citation at the end of the sentence and writing higher functioning occurred when, and then at the end just say, or giving me a parenthetical citation of Matthews et al. 2021. I'll show you an example of parenthetical citation when we get to class later in this lecture. A couple of other picky things I'm just going to summarize here together. Try to avoid unclear pronouns. When you refer the word it, or you say this was important, or there is something, unless you tell us what it is, the reader can sometimes be confused in the context of the sentence. So generally speaking, look to remove or reduce. If you're going to say this was important, maybe you say this structure was important. So we know that it's the structure that was important. That can be a really helpful way to improve the clarity of your paper. For the sake of these kinds of papers, this is a research paper where the goal is to highlight other people's previous research, not necessarily your beliefs, your thoughts, your opinions. There are other types of papers where you can do that. So you're really going to avoid referencing yourself in any way. Instead, your own thoughts or beliefs might come into the way that you have organized the paper. It's your paper and you get to get your agenda across. But what you got to do is you do that in the way that you highlight what's the most important and you organize top to bottom how the paper is going to go. For assignment 2, I'm going to ask you to minimize quotations. Generally in APA format, there are actually very few quotes. This is because quotation or quotes are not data. Numbers are data in our psychological research. And so quotations can be out of date fairly quickly. I would say the exception to this is, of course, qualitative studies where words are always data. But when you're talking about or summarizing previous research, you don't want to spend much time quoting other people's work. What you want to do is work on paraphrasing their work, summarizing and avoiding no more than 3 words in a direct row to avoid accidentally plagiarizing. But you want to work on paraphrasing their paper and trying to use your own words to get across their points. Other good scientific reminders: avoid contractions. Don't, can't, write do not, write out can't, cannot. Avoid ending a sentence in a preposition, like ending with of, to, and so on. And don't forget your final proofing. Check your spacing, check your punctuation, check your spelling, check your grammar, run a spell check. I always forget to run a spell check, but you really got to do it. It'll save you some points and it'll save you some time. It'll just be a stronger paper. See, there's always a few more APA picky things. I know we're almost done. We are almost done though. Couple of last things. These are mostly related to punctuation. At the end of a sentence, you're gonna, or terminal, what's called terminal punctuation, you're gonna use 1 space. It used to be period, space, space, and then you start the new sentence. It is just a single period and a space. You want to make sure you use an Oxford comma. And so this is when you're giving a list of 3 or more things, like Hallbrook collected, comma, analyzed, and then you do have a comma here, and reported. As opposed to some writing style formats that do not use this comma, APA style does. And if you're going to give me a list of things, then you have to do the list with the lowercase letter in parentheses. So Baith and colleagues, 2023, described 3 themes: A, ... lowercase b in parentheses, ... and, check out that Oxford comma, lowercase c in parentheses, ... When you write your paper, it's going to be, you're going to have a few headings. Really, you're only going to use 2. Generally, there's 3 types of levels of headings. There's actually 5, but 3 ones that you might come across. This is on page 48 of your APA manual. All level 1 headings, these are like higher order big sections, are going to be centered, bold, and title case. That means every important word is capitalized. Anything that's a subsection is going to be a level 2 heading, flush left, bold, also title case. And then you'll see, so the difference between level 1 and level 2 is just center versus flush left. The difference between 2 and 3, which would be a subsection within a subsection, then you're going to italicize it. Otherwise, they're all bold, they're all title case. To give you an example, this is from one of my papers where method, or my method section, was bold and centered. Participants was left aligned and bold. And then you can see that one of the subsections from, this was actually from the instrumentation section, you just can't see it, is bold, left aligned, and italicized. For your own paper, you're probably going to be using level 1 headers. Like I said, you're not really going to get into subsections. You'll need this for the title of your section on the first line of your paper. So basically the title of your paper will be bold, center, and title case. Then your bibliography is bold, center, and title case. Later in your graduate career, you might get into subheaders, in which case level 2 and level 3 will be appropriate for you. All right, that's it. When we come back in class, we'll pick up the rest of this lecture. It's going to be talking about how do we cite sources and text. Then we're going to practice the whole thing, the citing, the sources and text, and all these technical elements we already talked about in this lecture during class, looking at an example, just so you get an idea of what to look for and how to edit this in your own papers. All right, thank you.